Hello, hello, and welcome to another podcast episode of Overpowering Emotions, where I talk all things big emotions, emotion regulation, resilience. We are still on our journey of resilience. And today I have a special guest. I'm thrilled to be bringing on Dr. Celeste. She's a family practice forensic psychologist. She specializes in working with families in difficult situations and is currently on a preliminary mission to help at least 1 million families get out of the rut of co-parenting battles. And we know that that can be really stressful. It drains people of their time, their energy, their resources, and quality of life. As a co-parent herself, Dr. Celeste sees it as an essential topic, for us to be able to talk about this and to make the most of life that they have, even when they're faced with consistent undesirable family circumstances. And today's topic is a great one because we're talking about family dynamics and the importance of them in terms of resilience. And she'll have some great practical strategies just to build resilience within our families, even if we are in a really stressful situation. So thank you for joining us and hope you enjoy. Well, Dr. Celeste, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start off by having you introduce yourself to the listeners?
All right. So I like to call myself Dr. Celeste. It's a little less formal. I tend to be pretty laid back. But I am what I call a family practice forensic psychologist. And I do that because when I say forensic psychologist, people think CSI and all of these things. But actually, I work with families, but I also just happen to be trained in mental health law. So my practice is focused on families who are mandated to receive some sort of psychological service in order to get custody, time with their kids, or for the courts just to figure out what to do with families, typically after like a divorce or a separation.
Okay. Important work, probably stressful work, I imagine.
Actually, I really like it. A lot of people are like, I don't know how you do that. But for me, it's kind of like people are in such emotional distraught that sometimes it's just hard to think clearly. And you can do that for them. And so sometimes little things can make such a big difference. So I find it rewarding. So I guess it's a little different way to look at it, but I love what I do.
Oh, good. Well, that's good. That's important, right? And especially when we're working with families who are in such distress, I can only imagine the amount of stress. And actually, it's a perfect topic to, swing into resilience because resilience is all about having these big stressors and adversities in our life. So maybe let's just start out with, why should we care about resilience? Why even talk about this?
Well, I just to go on a little bit of a tangent here, I've worked with folks who have had someone die to suicide, right? And they're still here, right? And so those folks have to be really resilient. And sometimes it's a parent or a child, which is really hard. And so a lot of those people are like the definition of resilience. And what I've heard a lot and what I hear a lot from people who are suicidal is that they just feel done. They feel like they don't have there's nothing left, right? They don't have anything left. They don't know what to do. Their resources are tapped. And I don't mean to go too extreme and talk about suicide, but I do feel like resilience for a lot of people feels tapped out when they feel suicidal, right? And that's like the ultimate like distress. And so, people feel how they feel about suicide. When people tell me that they're suicidal, to me, that means they don't have any more resources left. They don't know what to do. They feel overwhelmed. They feel like they can't handle it. And I think that resilience is that space right before you get to that point, right? So if you have it and you're going through all of these difficult things, you don't necessarily feel like you can't do it, like you're tapped out. You're like, okay, I'm going to push through anyway. But a lot of people, they struggle with that, right? And if things keep happening after thing after thing after thing after thing, it's hard to have that. So I think like technically it could be a life or death sort of thing if you don't have any resilience at all. The more you have, the more buffer you can from, like wanting to even end your life. So again, that's more of an extreme. I think a lot of times we hear resilience, we're talking about like, just life trials that we're going through and kind of getting through them. But when you don't have any resilience and things keep happening, what happens. Those are the things that I typically hear about. So I think it's very
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. And so how would you define resilience? I know that there's so many different definitions out there, but from your perspective and your work.
So I just define resilience as going through something that's difficult and pushing through. So it's not that you don't think it's difficult. You think the same thing as the person who hates it, right? It's also going through it, but you find the strength, the inner strength to push through and get through it, to overcome it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know we're going to be talking about family dynamics today and the importance of, family dynamics when we're talking about resilience. And especially, I mean, I focus on children and teenagers and in families, but it's really important for all of us and all of that. So maybe let's just talk about what some of those family dynamics could be and how they contribute to or take away from some of that resilience.
Okay, so again, I'll go on a little bit of a tangent. So I think that I have something for the readers to review today, but one of the things that I talk about in there is that you learn resilience from like birth, right? If I'm a mom of a 6 month old and I'm completely overwhelmed and I don't know what to do, my baby can't talk, but they're still feeling those things that I'm going through, right? And so you hear a lot of times, like, babies are fussy when mamas are struggling too, right? They feel that. So it starts really, really young. And I have a young child, right, who's 6 right now, and when I'm stressed out, he can feel some of my stress too, right? So it continues. And so, excuse me, I think just having any sort of emotional state can affect other people in your family, right? So it can be that simple as just, being stressed or feeling depressed or feeling overwhelmed. Now, I typically work with folks, like I mentioned before, who are going through really difficult circumstances. And a lot of times they'll say, these things are happening with my kids since the separation, right? And there's fighting and disagreements, and the kids are witnessing that. And what a lot of times what I tell people is, well, your child doesn't know how to express what's going on inside, but the things that you feel, they're feeling too. They just don't have the capacity to, verbalize in the same way that we do. And so this is what you're seeing. And so if you're experiencing these things, maybe together you can kind of heal, right? And do some sort of coping, some healthy coping things together, whatever that might be. And so those are more like, families breaking up. That's really difficult. But let's say, you get fired from your job and you have to be home and you're used to playing with your kids after work, but you don't have the energy, right? And so then your kids feel that, and there's a sort of shift in their world as well. And they didn't lose a job, but they did lose a piece of their parent, right? And so that's a family dynamic that could be affected. So their mood shifts, your mood shifts. And so there's this theory called the excitation transfer effect, which a lot of times when I explain it to people, I say, just think of like a great mob of people, and somebody's like, I'm going to start a riot all of a sudden, right? And then other people just jump in, right? That energy that we have as humans, it spreads, right? If I walk into a room right now and you're sitting there and you say, hey, good morning, and I'm just like, and I shut the door, you're not going to feel the same way that you did when you said, hey, good morning. You're going to feel some of my negative energy, whatever that is. So I think ways that can affect family dynamics are enormous, right? It could be something as simple as having a bad day. Like I mentioned, the losing the job thing, and your kid experiencing some shift, even though their shift is not yours, they're still experiencing that. Or it could be these more significant things where families are breaking up. So it just could manifest in a lot of different ways.
Right. So what can parents, caregivers, families do to foster resilience in their own families?
Well, there's a lot of things you can do. One of the things I love to tell people, it's conventional, unconventional. It's just, seeking out laughter. I tell people I like to laugh every day. Sometimes it's really difficult to do that, right? Some days are really tough. But just seeking out things that that lighten your load a bit. And so for me, it's laughter, and not just like, haha, that's funny, but like actual, like belly laughing funny. Because for me, it boosts my spirits. And then I don't go to bed like drained and exhausted. And I feel better when I wake up. So I think people could do things like that. I think physical activity is really good for that, right? And raising those endorphins if we want to work with the brain. Of course, there are certain foods you can eat. I think communication within families is huge. That word gets thrown around a lot. I think that sometimes when we say it, it's like, oh, we're communicating, but you're not, right? Communicating has a purpose, right? And when you start and end, there should be some sort of resolution, right? If it continues, you didn't actually communicate, right? So opening up the doors for, if it's like having a bad day, the space for, saying, hey, I had a bad day, whatever it is. I think communication's huge. I think that when you have disagreements, being able to disagree and not trying to force the other person to have your same feelings about it is really important too. I think, I think in families, I hear the word should a lot, right? And I'm always like, well, what does that mean, right? And whose voice is that, right? Should according to who? And so just being really careful about language. You could do a lot of things, but
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, those are some great ideas. And I know I've written a blog article about some of these family dynamics, and you touched on a lot of them. I'm just curious, out of my own sort of curiosity, I guess, just how to get that good belly laugh. Because I think sometimes, it's all great to say that, and we could go and watch some funny home video shows, or I actually, my girls used to, when they were younger, would look at these YouTube videos, like
Mhm.
try not to laugh kind of videos. But for you, what do you find helpful?
I was just going to say there's a couple of people on YouTube who do really silly things, right? And you can't help but to laugh. I actually like really silly humor. So I might do a movie. So a couple of things. I'm going to go backwards. I don't know if you remember the show Curb Your Enthusiasm. It's like really dry humor
Yeah,
with everything.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
laughing just thinking about it. And so sometimes, especially, I used to work with kids in like juvenile justice, and some of those stories were really hard, right? And so people were like, "Oh, did you watch Intervention?" No, I did not watch that after work. I did not do that. I watched Curb Your Enthusiasm, right? Because I know that it's something that's light. It's going to kind of turn my brain off a bit and just allow me to decompress so that I can laugh, right? So I don't know what that looks like for people. I think for me, it's TV a lot.
Mhm.
I don't watch a ton of TV all the time, so it also feels like a treat, right? I don't have to use my brain. There's nothing that's required of me. And with YouTube, it's really accessible, right? And it doesn't have to be lengthy because now they have shorts, right? So it has to be a minute or less. And so you could just Google funny YouTube videos. Or yesterday, my son had me playing with his stuffed animals, right, and squatting around on my knees. And so that was kind of silly, right? Because that's not something that adults do all the time. And so playing with my child, right? And sometimes kids are really good. Well, I think a lot of times kids are really good for reminding you, right? Like, hey, what's wrong? Especially if your default or your baseline is not, like sad or overwhelmed, right? They're like, hey, what's wrong? And you
Right.
could play a game. You could do a lot of different things. But I think for me, the easiest thing to do is to watch something because it doesn't require anything and it takes less than a minute to implement. So
Right, which is super easy. We're doing music's big in my house with my family. I'm not as, like, music is important, but not as much for my girls. But we're doing the slick back. Me and one of my girls are trying to learn this dance, the slick back, and that's quite,
okay.
there's a lot of laughs in that, us trying to, figure it out. But anyway, that's something that we're doing. And I do find, like, I mean, the physical movement and the laughter really does make a difference, even after a really stressful day. And do you find, is there a difference, for families with younger children versus older children, or even the adults, kids? I mean, I've got one who's just transitioning to adulthood now. Is there a difference there?
Yes, I think there's definitely a difference. I think that some of the things that I mentioned with my own home life is, like little kids and playing and things of that nature. And so I think with younger kids, you can do things like that. I think though, with older kids, you can still do the YouTube stuff, right? Let's say you're having a hard day. It's like, what are you watching on YouTube, right? Like, what's the funniest thing? I need something to cheer me. I think your kids, when they're older, can still help you, right, in ways that uh, are really great because they understand a little bit more. Uh, and if you do that, right, you're showing them that you care about what they think, you trust their judgment, you're opening up doors for communication, which I talked about. And then you're also showing them how to be resilient, right? So I'm having a tough time. I'm trying to get out of it. I need help doing that, right? You're not saying that, but you are. And so they learn that they can ask for help doing the same. And you can create like a bidirectional process of fostering resilience in each other. So and then adults, I think once your kids become adults, it's really different. I personally feel like my mother's my friend now. I know she's my mother, right? But there are a lot of things that I could talk to her about now that is just I don't even think about anymore, just because I'm an adult person. I've been an adult for a long time, and it's just the dynamic just changes. So I think across the lifespan, your kids can be really, really helpful. It just changes how it looks.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up the point about it's okay to be stressed and, going to our kids because we are modeling those things. And I think we put too much. I mean, just being a parent already, I'm always saying, here's your baby, 5 pounds of guilt compounded daily for the rest of your life. And we're trying to be these
Yeah.
perfect parents who are always happy and everything's fantastic, but that's not reality. And then our kids are going to think, well, something must be wrong with me if I'm always sad or mad. Or so them being able to see, yeah, that we also experience these things, and then the empowerment and that they were able to help us. And I like our brain can't tell the difference between someone helping us and us helping them, so they're going to feel good, have all of those feel good hormones, and seeing that it's okay to ask for help, because I think that's another thing that people just have a really, in kids, teens, even adults, have a really hard time doing. And so there's just so many benefits. I'm glad that you brought that up.
One of the
That's
things that you made me think of too, you mentioned music. And I think for me, I do like music. I think that does require a little bit more thought. But one of the things I do to plan ahead for bad days, I have like I create playlists. So so I have this playlist called Unstoppable, and I was actually sharing it with my friend recently, and she's like, "Do you have see a song Unstoppable?" And I'm like, no, I don't. I definitely need that. So I put that like at the end of my playlist. And so if I'm feeling more like down and defeated, I'm like, I'm going to play this one first, right? And then I'll play the other ones. And they're all kind of like positive messages. So like Kelly Clarkson, Rise, that was on the Olympics, I think, a few years ago. It's just like all positive things, right? Because that can shift your mood too. It doesn't require much of you. I like things that don't require much of me to get those endorphins boosted. So that's another thing. When you were talking about that, I was like, you know what? I have several playlists. If I'm having a bad day, I'm like, I need to turn on this playlist.
well,
And
with
then I,
technology. It's with technology, it can be so amazing. I remember having a breakup in the 80s, maybe early 90s, and it was cassette tape, Richard Marx. And then you'd have to like rewind it back to the beginning, and like that was mine, over and over. Playlists, yeah, makes life a lot easier. And I imagine with a lot of the families that you work with who are in it, right? Like they are in the stress, high conflict divorce, or just lots of stress going on, and just struggling to feel like they can foster an environment for resilience, or they just don't have the capacity or time to do some of these things. Any thoughts for some of those families?
yeah, that comes up a lot. What I hear the most is like time, right? It's
Yeah.
like definitely energy, but I usually hear time for some time. It's like, well, it doesn't have to be a long time. Sometimes I say, just take a minute, right? just you get up, take a minute to yourself. If you can take 5, that's great. Just take that time just to exist, right? No obligation to anyone else. Most people can find a minute. Most people can find 5 minutes. And so, and then we just build from there, right? So I might say something like, all right, take a minute this week, come back, tell me, how it went. And you can either do nothing or you can do something, whatever that is. And people are like, well, that was really easy, right? 100% of the time, it's really easy to find a minute. So not expecting that, overnight, you're just going to have this resilience, like, I don't know what you want to call it, but just you're just going to have this all of a sudden, but just keeping it incremental, right? There's a book called Atomic Habits. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
that, right? I think in that book, he actually gave the example of a minute. Just start with a minute first, right? And what happens is you don't end up doing a minute, you end up doing more than a minute most of the time. And so even if you did the minute, it's an increment, it's a step forward. And that in itself, you kind of like showing up for yourself and being consistent for yourself can be a booster, as well as just taking the time. And then just knowing that you're going to take the time can all be really helpful.
It's being purposeful. And maybe like, and one of the things with Atomic Habits is, you're pairing it with something you're already doing. So if you're sitting on the toilet, maybe that's just to sit and
Exactly.
be, right? Just to sit
Uh-huh.
and be and breathe and be present. Like it's just those, and having a mantra can be helpful. Like you can do anything for a minute, right? So
Sure.
maybe it's that I can do anything for 30 seconds. I can do anything for a minute. And so it's just it's planting those seeds. And I think even with our kids too, if it's like, we're all rushed and we're at the rink and then we get home and then it's bedtime and it's just rush, rush, rush. 30 seconds. It's just a quick little YouTube video just to ground, have a shared connected moment. It doesn't have to be an hour meditation or an hour day-long outing with your kid. It's not Disneyland every day. It's just those little moments. We're planting those seeds. And over time, the seeds will blossom and they'll flourish. It just takes time, but it's planting them in the first place. So yeah, I think that that's really important. Um, any resources that you would recommend for families?
I think I had mentioned 3 books. One of them is Love Languages for Children. I don't think we talk about that book enough as a field. I hear people talking about love languages all the time for couples. And the fact of the matter is, you do love languages with every relationship you have, or you don't maintain it, or it's not a happy relationship, right? And
Yeah.
so, um, I think that one's probably at the top of my list, just because it's like I don't know that people think about that. It's like, how does your kid appreciate things? We have expectations for our children. We want them to grow up and be good people, right? And so it's like, these are my expectations. This is what I want for you. But they're individuals too, right? And they might be the same as us, or they might not be. And so I think that's one of the ones I would recommend. And then there's a book called The Miracle Morning. There's a regular version of that book. And if you don't like to sit down and read, right, you can do audiobooks. I love to do audiobooks. Depends on how your brain works. My brain can listen to a book and do other things. Some people can't do that, right? Some people want a physical book. But they exist in both platforms. But there's one specifically for parents and children. And so I know for me, like before I became a mom, I was a runner. I did 5Ks, few half marathons, and I have done 1 half marathon and 2 5Ks in 4 6 years, something like that. And so that is really something I want to get back into. And so I think, in addition to, I always advocate for taking care of yourself, because you're better for other people when you do that. But it's hard when you have kids. It's hard when you have multiple kids, right? And so that's another one that I would recommend. And again, it's kind of like being intentional with your day, right? So maybe you get up and you take a minute to just exist, and you take a minute to listen to a song or whatever it is, and just finding that time outside of your obligation to your family to just take care of yourself.
Great. And with the love languages, and I'll put all of those books and resources in the show notes. With the love languages on their website, there's actually a quiz, and you can have your kids do the little quiz. So there's one for partners, and there's one for teens, and then children as well. And they can do that just to see what those love languages are. And it's interesting because they can shift. You know, you might do one year, but they might actually shift too. So I love, yeah, that's a great resource. I'll put that in the show notes. And I'll put all of your information in the show notes as well. Where, if just for people who are listening right now, where's the best place for them to reach you if they wanted to look you up?
So I would say my website, drcelestephd.com. Also, I do videos on YouTube. Just started doing that. So there's some on there. You get like some resources that might be helpful, but that's all linked on my website as well. So I would say my website first. And my YouTube is Creating Change with Dr. Celeste, but that's harder to remember. So,
okay. Well, I'll have it all in the show notes too. So,
yeah. So I would just say the website.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. I greatly appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks again for having me.